We're all ready to go. So welcome to Scott's Views. We have a very special edition of the state of psychotherapy today. We've got our usual guest here, Dr. Brent Potter from it's South Carolina, not North Carolina, isn't it?
South Carolina, yeah.
South Carolina, USA, and of course, to remind people, he's a psychologist, a psychotherapist, an author. And we've also got a new guest today, a great guest I'm very excited about, is Michael Mantis from Michigan. And Michael is a retired master's level educator, art therapist, psychologist, and psychotherapist. And he has an orientation in the work of Jung's analytical psychology and Hillman's archetypal psychology. And he works in publishing for the last decade, since retiring from being a practicing psychologist, and is currently entering politics, and as he says, against his own better judgment. And he, as I say, he lives in northern Michigan with his family and is active in his local home church movement, which is growing greatly due to the tyrannical anti-church COVID executive orders of the Michigan's governor. So, Michael, very welcome very much to the Scott's Views, and it's great to have you on. So, introduce yourself. Say a bit more about yourself.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate being invited by both you and Brent, who I've known Brent for a very long time and admire his work, and is a great friend and true brother. And he pointed me to your work, and am digesting that and appreciating that very much. I think my little bio says a good little piece about what's happening, good little snapshot about what's going on. Today, actually, we're in the process of our state political elections for a political party, which is an interesting process considering my background in psychology and how that plays into the entire process, which really brings it back to against my better judgment. Getting against my better judgment. So,
aye, and so well, it's great to have you on, and
yeah.
We'll probably get into a lot of your views and reasons why you departed from the psychology realm, which we touched on when we spoke last week, which I thought was very interesting. The bureaucracy and the politics behind, which is always simmering in the background of psychology, the modern thing, etc., etc. But I'll just kind of introduce what I discussed we'd do today. Is here's my notes. That'll help, wouldn't it? So when I was thinking about this today's show, I was thinking about a book that I read over 20 years ago now called The Politics of Experience by R.D. Laing. Brent will know it very well. Maybe you know it as well, Michael, I don't know.
I do. I know it. And again, it's been over 20 years for myself as well, since I've seen it in my stack.
Yeah. Well, I first came across it when I was doing my undergraduate in psychology. And someone gave me a copy. I swapped something with them. And he gave me the copy of the book. And I was kind of, maybe it was that book. But anyway, I got a copy of it very early on in my psychology career. And I read it. I've read it several times. And, it was very, very helpful to kickstart a lot of ideas. It's written by R.D. Laing, who's a radical psychiatrist in the 1960s, who had a lot of important ideas about thinking about psychiatric treatment and the inhumanity of certain aspects of psychiatric treatment. And I've not read it for a few years now, but I moved. It sparked me to read further because that book was laden with references like Kierkegaard and Heidegger, James Hillman, religion. It was so deep. And the way he wrote it was very plain language, it makes it a very accessible book. And I think that's why it was very popular amongst a lot of people. They didn't have to have a huge education in philosophy to kind of get what it was on about. But
and for those who might not know or be old psychoanalytic curmudgeons like us, The Politics of Experience was a wild bestseller. I mean, just in the general public, it was even taught in high schools and things like that during the 60s.
Yeah, it was huge, wasn't it? I mean, it was like it was what was called a campus classic, as they say.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it certainly had a huge influence in me, and it kind of it soured academic psychology for me. It soured, you know. I mean, I was getting into it, and then I read this book, and I went, "Oh dear, I've chosen the wrong course. I think, and I've chosen the wrong path." And it took me years to kind of get out of academia, you know, get out of that academic kind of thing that I was trying to get, that I was had become wary of through his writings, you know. And so, well, anyways, there was the first great quote that I thought was very interesting was, and it's related to the kind of COVID situation we're in now, I think. More because a lot of these quotes are more relevant now, I think. They're even more pertinent. Mm-hmm. So this is the first one. This is R.D. Laing, Politics of Experience and the Birds of Paradise. That's the whole title of the book. The condition of alienation, of being asleep, of being unconscious, of being out of one's mind, is the condition of the normal man. Society highly values its normal man. It educates children to lose themselves and to become absurd, and thus to be normal. Normal men have killed perhaps 100 million of their fellow normal men in the last 50 years. And when I read that, you know, it made me think of the situation now with the COVID and this state of being asleep, because, you know, this idea of the blind faith in what the governments are telling us about the COVID situation and having to lock down and having to wear masks and having to stop working and having to shut the churches. And there's no way we can get out without an experimental vaccine with mRNA in it, which has got, like, I was reading an article last night talking about how it's got carcinogenic polythene kind of ingredients in it, which they need to use it for the make it work for some reason. And then the idea of vaccine passports, which have been, my wife mentioned that Sweden and Norway have introduced them. And of course this, and we've talked about this with Brent last time we were on the show about the statistics. It's like people have taken leave of their senses and they don't seem to look at the data. And I mean, in many different countries, the all causes death from year to year, and then comparing it to 2020, don't seem, you know, very much. There's nothing going on really. All causes death hasn't significantly changed, and then of course there's other things out with the COVID thing. There's the whole assault on society, I would say, of the queer theory and the trans agenda and puberty blockers for children. And so when I went back to that quote and I reread it the other day, I thought the condition of alienation, of being asleep, of being unconscious, in this, you know, this destruction of people, normal people, you know, at least silencing people for having being frightened of what's going on, being silenced and or even imprisoned through, you know, hate crimes and all that kind of thing. I mean, what do you guys think? I mean, it's quite a prophetic statement, I think. Brent? Michael?
Well, I was thinking about what you were saying, and I'm curious if Laing meant by the number 100 million in the last 50 years, which would be more like 100 years now. The only number that corresponds to that is the guiding philosophy of Marxism in its various forms. I'm curious if he was sort of insinuating something there, because he was a pretty thoughtful person in his writing. And Yeah, I don't know about other people's experience with this, but I've declined the vaccination. I'm not anti-vaccinations in general. I don't want to be lumped in that group, but I'm suspicious about this vaccination and want to know that it's safe before I plug it into my body or that of my family. And a number of people that I know just in general conversation have become sick as a result of taking this vaccination. A friend of mine got sick and his wife was hospitalized for a couple days. I mean, I'm finding that, as well as these draconian laws that they're attempting or have been implementing in many parts of the United States, make no sense on numerous levels, other than to kind of usher in. My suspicion is this is something like a scorched earth approach, where the left just wants to destroy everything to usher in their egalitarian utopia, whatever that may be, because we find even with the selection of their president here that laws are not lightening up. Things went right back down into lockdown, and they are just pushing, driving these businesses into the ground, which, you know, many of them, roughly half, may never recover. So it's frightening to me, and I think Laing was probably way ahead of his time. I suspect he probably saw a lot of these things coming, and I can't imagine that if he were alive today, that he would be down with the kind of socialist fascism that's trying to be installed.
It's
Yeah,
hard to look at the whole situation in without the whole context. Just looking at in terms of the vaccination, which is definitely a problem in the sense that medically, we don't know. It's been rushed. We also have to look at it in the context of, as you're talking about everything else, the tyrannical orders from governments. It makes me think about, there's a book that Jordan Peterson mentions, Ordinary Men, about a group of Polish police officers who were brought in to control the Nazis and turned from normal men as police officers to some of the worst perpetrators of violence during the Nazi regime. And it's pretty interesting to watch that dynamic happen, not only with the vaccinations and COVID, but across the board, like Brent mentions, with many aspects of our culture. It's hard not to look at the whole picture and see the left as making some kind of a large, big picture play for control and power. And it's the scale, to me, is amazing. The scale that they're doing it on in the global sense. Here we are, the UK and the US, here on this podcast, talking together, and that's only two places, but it's the same dynamic across the entire world, which to me is an amazing. The scope of their power grab is just amazing, and the loose association that they work together in to do it, I think, can only happen because of the technological advances, both in the sense of communications, and I know both Brent and you have seen in your podcast, Bruce, have talked about Heidegger, and Heidegger's idea of the machine mind and the machine thought really comes into play here. The alienation that you're talking about with Laing from this quote seems to come into play. That entire focus on alienation from humanity.
yeah.
Well, and there's a sense too that, and I didn't think about that before, but in framing, that Heidegger talks about a certain mindset, which is hell-bent upon calculative disclosure of the world, ordering things in terms of resources, things to be used as resources, is sort of operating in harmony with postmodernist ideology right now, which creates a terrific machine of organization, as you're sort of pointing out, not just in Scotland and America, but I've got one foot in the Philippines, and it is dramatic to see how an otherwise very conservative nation is being very influenced by these things. It's a very frightening combination, because both perspectives have in common an absolute lack of contextualism or self-reflection or thought. There's just no questioning their perspective from their perspective, and anything outside of that is the enemy. It's very frightening, I think.
Yeah, I mean the vaccine thing, the kind of the blind faith in this vaccine is very sinister, because I mean the media seem fast asleep, or either censoring a lot of information. For example, on Facebook, I tweeted, or was it Facebook? I put a post on something about Gibraltar, which is the British colony in Spanish. It's in the sort of Spanish sort of waters, but basically, there's been some concerns about the amount of deaths that have occurred since the vaccine's been introduced. You know, it's to be ascertained if the vaccine has got something to do with the deaths. Of course, there's other places like Norway and in England where the vaccine's been introduced and deaths seem to have occurred. But the thing is, the drug companies and the media don't seem to be concerned. Whereas if it had been COVID, you know, before the vaccine, it had been straight away, oh, they've died of COVID, or without a question about it. But there's no question about, well, maybe let's look at this. Let's look into it. I mean, because the medical products agency who approved the vaccines, for example, they said themselves they were looking at because it was rushed. It was a rushed vaccine, the 7 months, and the medical products agency, they sanctioned it to some of the tests to be modified so it'd come out early because of the emergency, and they expected a high volume of adverse reactions. Now, if there's a high volume of adverse reactions, where are they, and why aren't they being talked about in the media? You know, where are they? I mean, other people are talking about that. You know, you just mentioned yourself anecdotal reports of, and I've heard other people say exactly the same. So the kind of blinkered, let's not even talk about it. Let's not even talk about it and put our head in the sand. Really gives a feel of people just wanting and desiring to be asleep and being asleep. I mean, I'm trying to find this bit in the article that I read last night. Where is it? It was a bit about. Oh yes, it's about the concerns about messenger mRNA, which is a novel technology. You know, Heidegger talks a lot about technology, doesn't he? And the dangers of technology. He wasn't against technology, because technology can be very helpful. You know, obviously there's a lot of we are speaking now. Hadn't been for technology, we wouldn't be communicating, which is a good thing. But technology is a double-edged sword, and this is from the article, and it's from it was a letter that I got from the American organization, the Children's Health Defense, and it's addressed to Peter Marks, who's the director at the Centers for Biologics Evaluation and Research, the Food and Drugs Administration. And this is what it says here. Messenger RNA vaccines will not work without an inbuilt delivery mechanism that enables the mRNA to make its way into the cell cytoplasm. Moderna's and Pfizer's chosen solution is to use lipid nanoparticle LNP carrier systems the two mRNA vaccine manufacturers are using LNPs to encapsulate the mRNA constructs to protect them from degradation and promote cellular uptake. In addition to taking advantage of what vaccine scientists describe as LNPs, inherent adjuvant properties. However, the LNP formulations in both COVID-19 vaccines are PEG PEG-ilated, meaning that the vaccine nanoparticles are coated with the synthetic, non-degradable and controversial polythene glycol polymer, and which is a potential allergen and suspected carcinogen. So, and so, of course, when I got the ethics application paper from the Oxford vaccine trial, and it clearly states in there that because it's such a novel medicine, they don't know what the long-term side effects might be. And so there are causes for concerns, but these concerns are not being permitted to be articulated. And if you utter them, in social media, you get classified as scaremongering. But it's only science. This is just science. This is just...
Well, that dynamic, not being able to utter the truth, seems to be the core dynamic of all the of everything we're talking about in context, from what I would consider a real hellish marriage of Marxism and postmodernism. You can't speak the truth, and if you do, you're dissenting, and we can't handle dissent because we can only push forward one message.
Yeah, no, it's highly concerning. It's highly concerning, and it seems like, when Laing says society highly values its normal man, this normal man seems to be the man who puts his mask on, the man who social distances, the man who takes his vaccine, the man who doesn't dare challenge, the government narrative on vaccines. But that's quite a
right. Their ability, that's like a Hillman move you almost just made, sort of like to put an image to it. And I've never thought about it that way, but I think you're right. There's a kind of this man that Laing is sort of talking about as someone who is very much a part of this sort of postmodern ideology of like wanting to get the vaccine as quickly as possible, wanting to wear the mask, wanting to do all these things in order to be normal and to not be on the other side of things. And I think a few other things that are a bit frightening to me along with this normalcy is that it's simply expanding right now. There's absolutely no critical thought as to this vaccine, its mechanisms of action, although there is some information provided, but their efforts now to try and make it available to children is frightening, or develop one that they feel is good for kids. And they are already, by their own admission, working on, this is going to become a part of the technology in terms of they have this built into a database. So you can't, for example, here in America, you cannot go and say, I've got my $150, which is a bit pricey, and go pay someone and then get your results. You have to give all of your information, and that information is entered into the immunization general database that they keep. And now that they have that mechanism, well, they've had that for quite a while. Now they're just plugging this in. You can easily see that they're already working on how to make this a part of passports. Which are computerized now. It's not just the papers. They have a computer chip in there, and then from there, one wonders because they want to make this mandatory for everyone, how that's going to be rolled out. One wonders, like, can I renew my driver's license without that? Can I travel with my passport without that? Can I? And where is the line on that with this new normal? What can I renew my professional licenses without that? Can I, so my suspicion is that this is going to become something like, we're not going to make you take it, But if you'd like to file your taxes, travel abroad, get in a car, apply for another social security card or renew your social, or whatever it is, that you have to have this information in that database. And it's very frightening. You know, this normalcy is so unreflective. And, you know, again, it's that part of it that really bothers me. If this vaccine worked and was good for my family and me, I would be the first in line. And I hope that I'm totally, and my suspicions are wrong. I really do. So that everything goes back to completely normal and I can go to the movie theater later. You know, I would love that. But there's just so much that isn't thought about with this, and so much a political element to it. I've never seen a pandemic that's politically debated before. You know, if there's an outbreak of some horrible disease somewhere, like with the bubonic plague, that was never debated politically. Does it exist? Leprosy, does it exist? Does it not? You know, it just seems bizarre to me and a bit frightening.
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to, there's a great news channel in the UK called UK Column, which I've written some articles for. I wrote one, the psychological attack in the UK, which is got a lot of views. They were discussing yesterday in the news something very interesting. You know, that all the governments say we're all in this together, and it all seemed very coordinated. And as you're probably aware, Iran has been under economic sanctions and political sanctions from the outside, from the US government, etc. And the Iranian, I don't know which politician, the health minister or whatever, wrote a letter to, you know, the United Nations, the UN or whatever, and was basically saying, you know, we're wanting to develop medicines for the pandemic, and because of these sanctions, we're being deprived, and we're not happy with the efficacy and safety studies of the, you know, some of the vaccines like the mRNA, and you know, so it's like the narrative of the governments, we're here to save you, we've got to save the world, we've got to save all people from the pandemic. But, you know, they're obviously preventing a country like Iran from developing it. And it's like, and then of course there's the whole fiasco with the UK in the European Union. The European Union are having a hell of a time getting the vaccines out. And then Britain's got lots of vaccines, and it's like, well, come on, what this was meant to be discussed, wasn't it? And it's so political. It's so political. And like, or another example, Switzerland haven't approved one of the vaccines. They say the safety. It's the Oxford vaccine, actually, from England. They haven't approved it because they haven't seen enough data to suggest it's okay to give to people. And yet they're giving it to old vulnerable people all over the place in the UK. And the media is not describing this. I mean, it's a shit show, really. It's a shambles globally.
It seems to be that this notion of the normal man that Laing is talking about here is what we could call the collective man. And in this strange, brave new world of Marxism and postmodernism, to become a collective man, you're required to abdicate individual identity to the collective identity, and to give up the notion that one can be an individual within the collective. And that seems to be happening across the board in all the contexts we're talking about, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, you see, what's really shook me to the core about this is that the normal man, and how fluid that they've been in the last year. From, you know, at the beginning it was just 3 weeks, stay at home, flatten the curve, and then we'll be all out of it, and it'll be no problem. And you know, and they were just, you know, they were having a go at anyone who kind of disagreed with that idea, and just stay indoors for 3 weeks. It's not a huge sacrifice. And then it was, let's wait until we get the vaccine. And now the vaccine's here, and now the demographics of death pretty much everywhere is that if you're above a certain age and you're elderly, you've got underlying conditions, you'll make up the most part of the deaths from COVID. So the sort of the rationale would be surely that, well, okay, if you vaccinate these people who are vulnerable to death from COVID, well, then the rest of the society should be able to open up, because the risk of any hospitals being overwhelmed, etc., will be, it'll be gone, because the most vulnerable will be have been treated, and therefore normal society can get back to normal. But it's not happening. And of course, the normal man has moved with the government narrative the whole way. It's like, and then you point it out, 3 months ago you said that, 6 months ago you said that, and it's like they morph, they keep changing and evolving with the narrative as it goes along.
Well, if basic fundamental logic isn't making sense, then the objective must not be what we're thinking it is. And the objective likely has nothing to do with a virus. The objective has more to do with ways to gain power and control over individuals and nations as a whole.
Yeah.
Well, and I don't know, I'd be curious to know if this is happening in your neck of the woods, but here, as far as I can tell, the numbers keep getting greater and greater and greater as to how many vaccines they feel they need to distribute in order to reach efficacy. So Biden is now like, we're going to do 200 million vaccines in like 10 minutes. And the numbers seem to be like, oh, we need 60% of the population to be, we need 70, we need 80, we need 10. And it just makes me wonder, why is there this like urgency involved in this postmodernist ideology? Like, what is this big urgency that's not just behind that, but you find it behind the identity politics, you find it behind, it just makes me really suspicious. And my wife, who's much more practical than I am in her view of things in a wonderful way, she's like, if someone walked up to me and said, here, I want you to drink this, I wouldn't say, oh, okay. I would say, and then why would a million people need to drink this? And who are you? Like, it just doesn't make sense on so many different levels. It's baffling.
You mentioned that urge. I wonder, Brent, what the urge leads to. What that urge to have everybody comply, what the end game is, what the final ultimate outcome is that they're searching for is. It that image seems obscured but powerful.
Well, that's an excellent point, and I wonder about that, because if you look at the deconstruction method inherent in the Marxism and the postmodern ideology, things like that, that's constantly deconstructing, and it bumps up against itself sometimes. Like, Muslims, are they a minority and we should really look up to them and hold a special place for them? Or is the fact that they burn gay people alive and perform female genital mutilation an issue? There are these certain ways in which deconstruction starts to bump up against itself, where some people are feminist, which is good, but they're too feminist or not the right kind of feminist, and then they're turning on each other. You can find it in every kind of compartment. And it makes me wonder, when they usher in this egalitarian utopia, what is that? Like, if you follow their logic to its conclusion, as you're sort of pointing out, okay, great, let's say 100% of people and babies get the vaccination, and the financial situation is such that all of our money is taken and pooled and distributed evenly by a mathematically precise percentage. Like, what is this egalitarian utopia that we're seeking? Or is this something like, and I wonder this, Stephen Hicks picks up on this a little bit, is it just Stephen Hicks says, there are some people who just like beating up on other people in one sense or another. Is this sort of like Bion's notion of a formless destructiveness that it's really just about destructiveness. And Hicks also picks up that there's a certain amount of like Nietzschean resentment going on here in he's a philosopher, not a psychologist, but in his suspicion, he says, what might be driving this is you have to wonder, this postmodernism hits people at a certain age, in their 20s or something, college age. And then what happens to the person who never takes the leap into the world to sort of extend themselves into the world? And they're left wondering, what happened? Like, I'm not successful and I see all these other successful people out there. Or the person who does take the leap out into the world, extends themselves and gets beaten up and withdraws and considers themselves kind of a mediocrity and looks out at those who are successful and things like that. If you kind of follow the flow of the logic, one wonders really what is driving this egalitarian utopian dream and how much resentment, and then if it's really a defined thing that they mean to achieve, or is it just destructiveness, like we're just going to hammer away at the 1% and people who are more successful than me, or people I think are racist and whatever.
I'll let you go first, Michael. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. As each group falls, it seems there's another group to take its place. And so ultimately, we've got the Ouroboros that devours its own tail. This ideology completely devours itself,
right
down to the smallest minutia. And it seems, to me that at that age, Brent, that you're talking about, somewhere in the 20s, there's that step that particularly in the most recent generations, people are failing to take, that leads from the urge to return to chaos, to the waters of chaos, instead move into the world of creativity and life, where there's a possibility of loss and failure, the guarantee of loss and failure, and that urge to stay prototypical and not move on. And I think that people that are aware of that dynamic see it as a vulnerability and exploit it. These people that postmodernism and Marxism. And I think that's also something that seems real important to me. Just as we're sitting here talking about these issues and wondering, why are we doing this to ourselves and to each other? There are people that are looking at these ideas and saying, how can we use this to gain power and control?
Yeah.
There are also people like that.
Yeah, it touches on a point later on about the kind of where is the piece of paper that I had about it was about the use of the march, that was basically the march through the institutions and the Marxist idea of infiltration and bringing in a kind of communism, which seems in line with a lot of the things that's happening now in the world. But it relates next to the next point, the next quote of Laing, and I'll read it out. He says, "What we call normal is a product of repression, denial, splitting, projection, introjection, and other forms of destructive action on experience. It is radically estranged from the structure of being. The more one sees this, the more senseless it is to continue with generalized descriptions of supposedly specifically schizoid, schizophrenic, hysterical mechanisms. And this is the good bit, I think. There are forms of alienation that are relatively strange to statistically normal forms of alienation. The normally alienated person, by reason of the fact that he acts more or less like everyone else, is taken to be sane, the masked man, the social man. Other forms of alienation that are out of step with the prevailing state of alienation are those that are labeled by the formal majority as bad or mad. And so, so if you're not masked up, if you're not getting vaccinated, if you're not social distancing, if you're not for the greater good, you're now regarded as bad or insane. And indeed, in legislation in the UK government, it's all written into it in a very hugely convoluted way of public health-ism, so to speak, whereby, you know, if you're a public health risk, you can be put away, you know, put in isolation. And of course, I was reading this the other night, a chapter out of this book. It's exactly what they did in Soviet Union.
Yes, same dynamic, same pattern happens over and over through history. And if you follow world history back prior to Marx, you see the same patterns, which is fascinating to me. It's a human nature issue we're looking at. We're not looking at political ideology issue, which is the fascinating part to me, because we carry this with us. And we can see it in microcosm in our own individual life as well as we can in the collective. You know, it's interesting too, Bruce, that you mentioned the common good and how we define that, because we use those terms and we use them in without even knowing it in that postmodern way. We assume that the good is common good, but what we're calling the common good is possibly as destructive as it can get on a collective level.
Yeah.
You know, that's a really good point, Michael. And just to circle back to something just real briefly, is I think this does have some kind of archetypal, almost Platonic-like dimension to it that really does stand outside of Marx. It's really not a Marx issue in some sense. It's just that it's clear and defined to pick up his piece and his work and to watch it through history. I mean, that's in black and white.
Yeah.
But then as a psychoanalyst, you got to wonder, like, or depth psychologist, like, well, how? Because he wasn't even that smart.
Correct.
I don't think. I mean, he couldn't take baths. He never worked a day in his life. He lived off his buddy. I mean, he was very exploitive. He was just almost animalistic in the way he lived. And one wonders, how could a man like that write a book like this? Like, where does that come from? And there is an archetypal dimension to this, as well as what you were pointing out, that there are people who can stand above this a little bit and then work others like puppets, which is, it's not unintentional, it's not accidental, it's not anything, that there are people who make careers out of this ideology, who see it, identify it, and make careers out of it. And in every socialist system, while there's widespread destructiveness and a surprising amount of people who just fall into line, National Socialism of Germany being the most shocking, perhaps. But there are always people who land on top, always people who, Venezuela, et cetera, et cetera. There, Bernie Sanders. I mean, the man has never worked a day in his life and is like a brilliant con man because he's figured out how to sell these fast talking ideas to slow-minded people, and the cars he drives, how many homes I mean, he's killing it. You know, yeah.
Parasitic. And it strikes me that it ranges all the way from petty tyrants, someone we might think of as a Bernie Sanders, to folks that have intentional, massive scopes of control. People like Hillary Clinton come to mind.
Oh, wow.
that have bigger ideas for that. And it strikes me, you know, I often think, where does this originate from? I wonder back to whatever we consider to be the beginning of man. There was somebody who said, you know, all these people are growing wheat or gathering wheat, and if I offer to store this wheat, a little bit, this wheat from everybody, and I take a little bit off the top, now I have 1,000 times more than the 100 people that are storing their wheat with me. This is a parasitic mindset, dynamic pattern, and I'm not sure where it originates from, but it seems like something that we all have to deal with on both an individual and a collective level, and that we've allowed to get out of control in terms of this kind of a parasitic dynamic.
Aye. I mean, some people would say, more religious minded people might say, that this kind of parasitic thing is quite, I mean, I don't want to frighten people who watch it, but it's satanic in its kind of origins, you know, the kind of, it flirts with the passions. It flirts with desire. It flirts with the narcissistic elements in our kind of, I mean, you know, in Bernie Sanders just grifting off communism and socialism, you know, selling some sort of, oh, you can have a utopia, you can get anything you want because God is dead, of course, and you can have paradise on earth, you know. And
Yeah,
Right.
it reminds me of there's an academic in the UK. She's kind of portrays herself as a kind of lefty Marxist person, and you know, and she's an academic, and she's, you know, she's grifting off this being kind of cool, but, you know, trying to be a bit radical now and then. But, you know, and I pointed out to her that, well, you know, it's not very great Marxism really, because she was trying to big up. Marx had some good ideas, you know, not trying to be too controversial, you know, not forgetting the 100 million dead from communism, of course. But so I pointed out to her, I said, well, yeah, have you read the Communist Manifesto recently? You know, it sees the family as a threat, you know, wants to destroy the family. And it's not a kind of healthy thing. You know, it's not a healthy thing. You know, the research shows it. The research shows that a child born into a family of, it is a controversial thing to say nowadays, but a man and a woman, preferably married, you know, and they have, you know, and all the different outcome measures that you want, like education, health, substance misuse, etc., education, job prospects. You know, generally speaking, it's a good setup. It's been proven for many years. It's a good setup. And of course, when you present this to them, it goes dead. Because what the alternative is, the postmodern queer theory idea of any relationship and any sexual desire should be fulfilled, or hedonistic desire rather. You know, anything you want to give you, and it's like the temptation, isn't it? It's like you have anything you want, utopia, but it's extremely destructive. And then, of course, if you get in their way, if you get in their way and say, well, maybe we should have some thought about this for society, for the world, it's like, well, you know, you're labeled as insane, a danger to the public health.
Yeah, a threat and neutralized. You know, and it's interesting, Bruce, the paradox. You really mentioned a paradox there. We look at the family, and you know, we call it the nuclear family. They take these ideas, they take them down to the core, and it seems like there's this attempt to reduce, this attempts at reduction back to the image that comes to mind is the image of chaos, a reduction back to nothingness, ad nauseum. You know, this continual tearing things apart, as Brent mentions, constant deconstruction, decontextualization. At the same time, the paradoxical image is the language that they use to talk about it, in the sense of things getting better, things having more, constantly having enough, or what you need, or making sure everybody is taken care of. And that paradox seems pretty clear when you give it any thought. And then it circles back around to what we're talking about in terms of the ultimate message isn't this or that, but to be confused, to not know, to not to speak the truth, to have an absence of questioning, not an answer either way, but to simply constantly be without knowing, or not even being able to inquire. That dissent, you know, inquiry equaling dissent in some way, whereas inquiry normally, it's we're talking about normal inquiry is the normal state of human being, and when we try and erase or eradicate inquiry, we go back to that notion of Heidegger's machine mind, that there isn't any independent
It's a
thought.
kind of murdering of thought. It's like Bion's negative K
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
minus K, where it's a complete attack on thinking, attack on relationships, attack on feeling. And then if you, because, and that's been kind of my gripe, is sort of like there's no thinking, no critical thinking in this. We have a brand new vaccine. Okay, great. Is it safe? What about this vaccine? What about, or a claim such as we live in a rape culture. How do you know that? What is a rape culture? How do you define? There is systemic racism. What is systemic? I mean, even raising the question, as you're pointing out, or trying to think about it in any critical way, what is the evidence? What's not the evidence? What's is seen as, well, then you're a part of the problem.
What an
You're
image!
not normal man. You're out here.
What an image for the atomic age. You know, Oppenheimer, when he developed the atomic bomb, they developed the bomb, and then he said, "We have become the destroyer of worlds." There was no forethought that was conscious to that. It was an awareness after it happened that we become the destroyer of worlds without the questioning to begin with. It's which is an interesting and very sad.
This is what's quite dark about what's going on. It's almost like a willful trajectory to destruction.
Very much so, Bruce.
It's like
it's that intention. It's that intention, that willfulness that blows my mind. That reduction back to that nihilist reduction back to nothingness is something that people embrace. That is an amazing, you know, brings up sense of naivete to me, that I would think that that's the truth, but it seems to be the truth that there are people that actually embrace that willfully.
I'll give you
well, and that requires a kind of schizoid thought, which links back through to the Laing idea of this completely narcissistically, like a black hole in the mind, just completely collapsing on itself, schizoid narcissism with absolutely no sense of something out there. Postmodernism can't understand anything out there. And this isn't just referring to the religious dimension. Jung was not a Christian per se, but he definitely had a big sense of large internal things happening internally and externally that are not me. Mythology, archetypal themes, dreams that happen to me, all kinds of things, certain experiences that we just find ourselves, moods we find ourselves in, things like that. In their world, it is just like this collapsing black hole that has no understanding whatsoever of any larger process of which they may be a part. And you see this self-evident in, I could call Washington State literally today and say, I am a woman and you need to change my birth certificate. I want my driver's license changed, and I identify as being Black and 7 feet tall, and then that's cool. Well, and because that makes sense only relative to this schizoid, divorced from reality sort of mindset that seems to be at play. And like it has a internal combustion, so to speak, that seems to be self-propelling in this almost at an archetypal level, and then people willingly go with it.
Yes.
All this before I forget, it reminds me of this kind of postmodern queer theory connection in Satanism, so to speak. So I wrote an article recently, a few months ago, on queer theory in primary schools, you know, from children from 5 years up till 11 years old, and you know, it's based on sort of queer theory ideology essentially. And when I looked into it, you know, a lot of the darker aspects of queer theory, the ideology, that it's, as it was quoted in a text that I read, it was quoted as queer theory is contra reproductive futurism. In other words, they were even questioning why should we even go into schools to disseminate queer ideology, because actually we're against reproductive futurism. So the idea of bringing queer theory to children is antagonistic to the idea of queer theory. I mean, it's a very dark place to go. And of course, in the queer theory world, you get a lot of people who are interested in the occult and of course are anti-religious, you know, and want religion to be of like the communists did, of course, like all the communists did. And so this darkness is in this willfulness, as Michael said, you know. I was going to give an example. Someone told me about a video, it was on social media, of some young people, maybe in their 20s, near here, at a small town. And they were filming themselves taking heroin, right? And they put it on social media. And one of the people on the video was slumped. I mean, completely out unconscious almost. And they were making him basically inhale more heroin by burning it and putting a straw up his nose or something. I can't remember exactly the details. And they were laughing about it. This kind of degraded, black, chaotic behavior. And then again, of course, on social media, you get examples of people during lockdown showing how much they're drinking, bottles of wine, and saying, oh, I've got 4 bottles of wine for tonight. This kind of nothingness, this blackness, chaos. There's nothing else other than that moment of just oblivion that they're getting into.
Yeah, and both of you mentioned that notion of otherness. You know, and it's interesting because we think of otherness, the normal conception of otherness includes inherently a self and other, a relational aspect. Yet it seems they're pushing this. You mentioned trans, queer theory, which, you know, when you talk about generational futurism, it brings up ideas of transhumanism that we're heading toward as well, which is perhaps another topic. But this notion of otherness as so other that I am other to myself, that I'm completely alienated from being, period. Alienated from being, to that nihilistic non-existence. Otherness being something vacuous, not something that's relational in the sense of a lack of connection, but nothing even to connect to. That kind of nihilism of non-existence that relates back to that generational futurism. That do we even want to continue as a race?
Mm-hmm.
You know something that brings us on to one of the quotes. I'll miss one of the quotes a bit I had, but I'll go to the next one. But of R.D. Laing, this idea of a medical technological kind of tyranny, willful destruction of humanness. You know, the technical kind of orientation of therapy, the medical technical. What's the word? Colonization, I suppose. You know, Heidegger said, you know, when he wrote in the Zolokon seminars, somewhere along the lines of, you know, if you make psychotherapy into a technique, you know, you're only got to get a polished object at the end of it. You know, you're not got to approach a human being. And because as Laing said this in the Politics of Experience, and I think this is not just in the therapy world, but in general world, it's getting this idea of meeting and otherness and presence and witnessing and etc. is getting erased, especially with a kind of communistic postmodern bent on it. But he says here, the psychotherapeutic relationship is therefore a research, a search constantly reasserted and reconstituted for what we have lost, and which some can perhaps endure a little more easily than others. True, in the enterprise of psychotherapy, there are regularities, even institutional structures, pervading the sequence, rhythm, and tempo of the therapeutic situation viewed as a process. But the really decisive moment in psychotherapy, as every patient or therapist who has ever experienced them knows, are unpredictable, unique, unforgettable, always unrepeatable, and often indescribable. And of course, when you mentioned when I spoke to you last week, Michael, you know, the amount of bureaucracy involved in therapy, this kind of destroys all that. And that kind of, there's a kind of socialistic bureaucratic structure invading every aspect of our lives, controlling it.
You know, I had an interesting experience educationally. My first vocation was in the arts as an illustrator, in commercial illustration, and from there I went through an educational master's program with a specialty in art therapy. And it was only after that that I followed up with a master's in clinical psychology. And point being, I learned much more about engagement in the psychotherapeutic process through the art therapy education than I did through the clinical psychology education. In working with the arts in psychotherapy, it's a very interesting process because you are no longer in the same kind of dialectic between person in therapy and person guiding therapy. You have a work of creative work that you're working on together. So there's almost an alliance in dialectic or dialogue with this creative process, whatever it might be, whether it might be poetry, whether it might be visual arts, whatever that creative process is. And so it requires a great amount of perceptive attention and spontaneity that isn't as present in my experience in institutional education of psychotherapy. And so it is a great benefit to me to have gone through that process. The art making process, it would be almost like a dyad creating art, as opposed to what I learned as a psychotherapy process, which is more of a dialectical process that, as you say, ends up the objective being to polish something as opposed to create something. And so I very much agree with what you're saying there.
Yeah. I mean, it's you know, I think it's a how you describe there of what psychotherapy could be. I mean, I certainly experienced it in my own personal psychotherapy, and but in my different occupations or jobs that I had, I noticed very quickly that that was being willfully destroyed. It was almost like they didn't want such a kind of psychotherapy or human meeting to occur anymore. It was like let's put everyone into the algorithm, or make them aligned to it in some way, making someone a number, making someone it was like being put into a process in the Aristotelian sense of what he says is process, this idea get from point A to point B, and the outcome is, a polished object. Whereas in the idea of what Aristotle would call praxis, if I understand them correctly, doing something for the sake of doing it, which is good, like, meditation, not for getting enlightened, but for meditating for the sake of meditating, for it's good for you, or meeting another human being and being present, not for hoping.
I suspect that all three of us were fortunate in God, I think, blessed us in a sense to be able to go through psychology in our training at a very interesting time where there was still some freedom around these things. I don't know about for you guys, but my first analyst was a classical Jungian analyst who trained in Zurich and was completely unlicensed, charged me $45 an hour, and was really good at dreams and making films. And I think, like, thank God I didn't encounter someone who is engineered, has a degree in social work, and is only interested in producing a billable hour for an insurance company.
Amen.
Or something. There was freedom.
Yeah.
And today, and even with Artie Laing, James Hillman, the Dallas group, Duquesne, Pacifica, there were these movements and people moving through those things where there was a degree of freedom. still left, which wasn't to say it was anarchy and you just do whatever these are still very trained, very rigorously trained people, but that freedom is just gone. As far as I can tell today, I think there's a little hub of like depth psychology or psychoanalysis who can still kind of practice in a good way, but outside of that, it is just decimated. But I'm grateful, and I think that we all had similar like experiences of still encountering a kind of aliveness or freedom, creativity, spontaneity, humor, engagement, wonder in psychoanalysis and psychology that I just don't see there anymore.
What can psyche do with us, not what we can do with psyche?
What does psyche want?
Yeah, exactly.
A question that's just not asked anymore.
And requires perceptiveness, requires attention and perceptiveness to ask the question, what does psyche want, as opposed to having an end goal to begin with and trying to, in a Procrustean sense, fit people into it, which seems to be the entire field now. And I think you make a really good point, Brent, in the sense that, a decade or two ago, this was possible, this kind of training process. And I hesitate to just call it educational, but training process, just being exposed to the process itself happened, and it doesn't now. As Bruce mentions, the intention is to stop that process. It's it's a willful attempt to shut that process down, because we don't end up with the normal man at the end of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, it's bleak. It's very, very bleak. And again, it brings me on to this next brilliant quote by Laing. He says, and I might incorporate the further point, I'm looking at the time, but he says here, many people used to believe that angels moved the stars. It now appears that they do not. As a result of this, unlike Revelations, many people do not now believe in angels. Many people used to believe that the seat of the soul was somewhere in the brain. Since brains began to be opened up frequently, no one has seen the soul. As a result of this, and like Revelations, many people do not now believe in the soul, psyche. So who could suppose that angels move the stars, or be so superstitious as to suppose that one cannot see one's soul at the end of a microscope? It does not exist. And this kind of brought me to this idea of this kind of fading light of Christianity in the West, in the assault of this communistic global communistic surge, it seems, aided and abetted by other tentacles of this. I think, the queer theory, the identity politics, the rise of science and medicine as the god, as people being their own god. I'm a woman. I can say I'm a woman. And of course the COVID thing, and I think it leaves us in a precarious place. The loss of God and the fading of God, reveals itself in horrific places. The trans thing, and giving puberty blockers to children, and giving rushed medicines to the whole population, putting dust in the atmosphere to Bill Gates' idea. This crazy manipulation through the god of technology, and so my point was that it is very bleak in that sense, but I was thinking, do you think that it's not all breakdown as such? I mean, this could be a potential kind of breakthrough or liberation. I mean, in a sense, is this the shake-up and the wake-up call that the West, the West and the modern world needs? Could it be for many decades we've been too complacent? Like Solzhenitsyn argued, that the Wests have, they haven't heeded the warnings from the Soviet Union and what went on there, and how dark it became. We became very complacent and embraced the sexual liberation movement, You know, like you know, it's not a risk-free sort of endeavor. You know, the religious writer in America, E. Michael Jones. I don't know if you heard of E. Michael Jones. He's written a book called Libido Dominandi, the sexual liberation and political control. And you know, on the back of counterculture, which is ironic, R.D. Laing was part of counterculture, who was in it, so to speak, and was maybe put off the rails a little bit, you know, with the love affair of Eastern esoteric religions, for example, that kind of watered down Buddhism that Nietzsche warned the West about. So I mean, I was wondering, I mean, do you think that in some sense it's very dark what's happening now, but maybe it's a wake-up call, maybe there's a hope in it, maybe there's something that can come out of it in this kind of this Hegelian dialectic?
And isn't that a human nature dynamic? You mentioned that, and it strikes me, just looking at the Renaissance, plagues, death, destruction, wars, and out of it we have one of the greatest times of flourishing of the arts and creativity that we've seen, and that's a dynamic in human nature that seems to be present always. That you know, things are darkest before the dawn.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts, Brent?
Heidegger found himself in a similar space and talked about the darkening of the world. He called it, or the eclipse of the sacred. And he landed with Holderlin's thing of where danger grows, so does deliverance also. I am surprised that I find myself in sort of a both and perspective, in that I don't think most people are taking the dangerousness of what's going on now seriously enough. And I'm typically inclined or tilted towards optimism, but this seems very serious to me in ways that Heidegger and others with very high-powered minds could even imagine. I think that we're on a very dangerous trajectory here, and now have new means at our disposal, yes, unlike the previous attempts to implement this egalitarian utopia, whether it was Hitler's socialism, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, et cetera, we now have a lot more equipment that these folks can work with and incorporate, as we've seen, as Michael kind of pointed out, with the wedding of the left, or postmodernism and the enframing. But on the other hand, you know, the Bible says God can't be mocked. I think that there's a sense, even if one is non-Christian, that the sacred cannot simply be eradicated, because that would assume it's under our control, correct, which I don't believe it is. So in a sense, I have some optimism too, in that, you know, this has to reach some kind of fevered pitch. God willing, there won't be too many deaths involved, more deaths involved, and then something else will come through. It's sort of how democracy was born too. In Greece, you know, it was a bunch of people saying, listen, we're tired of this freaking people with their boot on our head and beating us into the ground. They went and they just took care of it and established democracy. You know, so good things will break through, I think. But I presently have a kind of a dark look at how things are going, and a kind of under preparedness that I think most folks have for this. It's not being taken seriously enough. And my main concern is that it's not until, as we've seen in all of these socialist examples, that like they're eating the animals in the zoo in Venezuela before people start going, hey, wait a minute, something's wrong here, you know, that it would be more wise to get in front of it a bit more.
I was just getting a book here. I read this book recently, Living Out by Lies, by Rod Dreher.
No, I haven't heard of that. Good.
A manual for Christian dissidents, and he basically he went to the old Eastern Bloc countries, Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, Poland, Russia, etc., and interviewed people who lived under communism there, you know, and try to see, and they all kind of were along the lines of what Solzhenitsyn was saying, that, you know, because you know, basically say what's happening in the West happened here. We can see the signs of it, and asking their advice. What should we do? What should we do? And one person was very kind of dark, a bit like you, Brent. A bit basically said, I think basically not enough people are awake, and you're going to have to live through this to find out. And that's quite a sobering thought. I mean, I've been to the Eastern Bloc a few times in the last couple of years, in the Ukraine and Lithuania, and I met a lot of people who lived under communism, and I was very struck. Therapists, psychologists, and a couple of priests and psychiatrists and people like that, and I was very struck with their religious outlook, their very strong spiritual kind of nature, so to speak, that was very missing in the West in a lot of contexts. Not everyone, of course, but I mean, it almost is like that hardship of that time brought out something very powerful in them, in their character, you know. I mean, I hope it doesn't take 70 years. I pray it doesn't take 70 years to get out of this. But we're on a trajectory that, you know, that it feels very much like it's got to be a battle, week to week, month to month, year to year at the moment.
Yeah, and that seems to me to be something, actually, I don't know why, but it feels hopeful to me that we seem to be pushed into making choices, making a major choice, a big choice between, for lack of a better way to talk about it, good and evil, that there is no middle ground here. And there seems to be something to me very hopeful about that. It's very heartening in the face of my own feelings of being very disheartened. You know, I mentioned entering into politics, and I really do consider it as a last ditch effort. You know, I want to live my life. I wanted to work as a psychotherapist without the heavy weight of the tyranny of the bureaucracy. I want to go grill some hamburgers and hang out with my family, but I'm being forced into this position to take certain actions and to pay attention to certain things that I don't have the choice to be apathetic about anymore. You know, Brent, you mentioned unpreparedness, and that seems to come up for all of us, that as we see this happening, we're the fortunate ones if we realize, whoa, unprepared. There are people that don't feel there's anything to be prepared for. And so we're fortunate in that sense. But strangely, it feels hopeful to be put in that position, to have to make that choice.
Yeah, I like that. There's a way that you can't kill psychic reality. Like Leon talked about someone who was a murderer. I don't know that it's a real clinical case, maybe, I don't know. But someone who's a murderer, and with great, sort of like postmodernism with its destructiveness, goes and kills a man. He kills the man that he wanted to kill. And he thinks, ha, I killed the man. But the man isn't dead. He continues coming back to him in his dreams. You know, he thinks that he was victorious, but in psychic reality, the torment was really just starting. So same with postmodernism and its sort of murderous vision of things. I think there's a way you can't kill off the sacred. You can't mock the sacred. There's a way that the sacred will come back. And I love your point, Michael, that there's a way that we can, like, I moved to South Carolina, not accidentally, not coincidentally, to the things that we're talking about. It has forced me to, rather than sit in a philosophical, phenomenological, psychoanalytic bubble, to really say, wow, this is real.
Yes.
What do I want my 2-year-old daughter to grow up in? You know, it's a serious question.
Yes.
You know, so that's an excellent point. We really are being forced to make a decision one way or another. You sort of have to be on the postmodern ideology, Marxist side, or you need to not be, which isn't to say you need to be a Christian, but that's going to probably entail some values around objective reality, family, freedom, and things like that. So, that's a good point.
I mean, I often felt I'll go through moments of darkness and very depressed about what's going on. But there's other moments, and I feel really alive, vibrantly alive, excited almost. I mean, it's almost like I almost enjoy hearing that bad piece of news on the radio that gets me annoyed. It makes me, how bloody ridiculous. And I feel alive for a few hours, thinking, what a lot of rubbish. And I'm alive, and I can see how false it is. And then I think this what's happened in the COVID thing, it smoked a lot of the frauds out. It smoked them out. I mean, for years, I was stumbling around in the dark, I feel, not knowing who really was the good guy and the bad guy, or the good girl, or whatever. It's almost like you can see now, there's nowhere to hide for these people now. A lot of these people who are hiding in their schools of psychoanalytic or philosophical bubble,
right?
Pretending when in this hiatus of history where nothing much was going on, and now a lot's going on, a lot of shit's going on, and the shit's hit the fan, and they're being smoked out.
And they can't help, it seems, but to overplay their hand. Get smoked out, and they don't have self-reflection. They don't learn. They double down. And we watch it happen in almost a caricaturist way, and we see them devouring themselves and blowing themselves up. It reminds me of Coyote and Roadrunner cartoon. Coyote keeps pushing it and keeps pushing it and keeps, which also brings up the notion of the trickster image that's so inherent to human nature, that we will explode ourselves strangely to our own benefit. When we explode ourselves back down to ego level and are no longer trying to be God.
Well, I'm looking at the time, and we've covered an awful lot. I mean, we could probably talk for hours, but I'm wary of the time for people. But have you got any other last things you want to talk about or cover before we end?
I just want to say it really, and I mean this like as sincerely as I can express it, I am so grateful to be able to just be in dialogue with the two of you, either here or just in our friendship. This is such a pleasure for me, and I really appreciate both of you, and just thank you, so much.
Well, I forgot, that's what I was going to say, actually. I mean, because of this crisis is dark, what we're going through, I think, but if it hadn't happened, we probably would have been having this conversation,
right? Yeah.
And I've had I've had conversations with yourself and Michael and other people. I've met other people, and actually life has become much more rich and exciting because of it. Easily enough. In lockdown, I mean, I've come across not just therapists and people, but other people, and I think, my God, there's people out there that are great people, and so if this hadn't happened, I wouldn't have met them, and it feels, in some sense, horrible to say, but it's better than the pre-COVID.
But in some ways,
you make a great point about feeling alive in the face of this kind of existential mortality issue. It makes you feel alive in that way, and on a personal level, I share both your appreciation for this kind of dialogue on a personal level and on a greater level, being able to connect in this way that isn't available in times when these things aren't happening.
It's I mean, I was there just before I came on to the Zoom today to record it, I said to my wife, I said, you know, I said, a year ago, I wouldn't have thought about doing a YouTube.
Right.
Two psychologists from America on. I mean, it's quite crazy, really. It's quite crazy.
And I wouldn't have thought of it either. Last night, you know, I was talking with my wife, and I said, you know, I'm going to go on and I'm going to talk to two doctorate level psychoanalytically based practitioners, and I'm at a master's level, and I said to her, you know, but nowadays I can just identify as a PhD if I want.
Well, you certainly can, Michael. I think you can
Absolutely.
very easily do that. It's been a pleasure having you on, both of you, and I think we should do it again, don't you?
Please.
Yeah, I consider this, if we want it to be, the beginning of a process. So it works for me. I appreciate it very much.
Great. Well, fantastic. Great having you on. So we'll end there, and well, keep watch for part 4. I take it'll be part 4. So
Yeah.
Sounds wonderful.
I'll just stop recording. So see you soon, everyone.